Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today it is finally time to do the final predictions for the 2020 season of the Overwatch League. Starting tomorrow, we will have the Grand Finals weekend kickoff with the final four teams competing for their shot to win it all and be crowned the Grand Finals champions. So, I'm going to just real kind of quickly run through my thoughts and predictions. I'm not going to do a bracket. I'm not going to do kind of a match-by-match breakdown. I'm going to talk about the team that I think is the most likely to win, who I think they're going to play. I'll give you my predictions for the first round of matches, and I'll give you kind of my predictions for the end. And I'll just kind of briefly talk about the four teams and how much I think they have a chance of winning. So let's start with the first match. We have Seoul versus San Francisco. This will be Thursday at 7 a.m. Eastern, 4 a.m. Pacific. I think San Francisco should win this one, though I think it is an interesting matchup. The shock of the teams we've seen so far, Shanghai, Philadelphia, and San Francisco, that have faced off against a Sigma-based composition. Obviously, the Seoul Dynasty run the Sigma, or not Sigma-based, the Hog-based. They're on the Sigma-Hog composition. Shanghai doesn't, San Francisco doesn't, Philly didn't, except for when they played against Washington. San Francisco struggled against Washington when they were running the Hog Zarya. Shanghai struggled a bit against the Sigma Hog as well. The Fusion are really the only team that didn't show any sign of weakness up against a Hog composition. They forced the Justice off of their composition, which to me actually is a really promising thing for the Fusion, but we'll talk about the Fusion in a little bit. So the Shock struggled against the Justice, who were running this Hog Zarya composition. They ran against a composition that they were kind of uncomfortable. And so I think it's an interesting matchup. But I think the Shock have had enough time to kind of adapt and learn how to beat it, especially because, you saw how they played against the Fusion. They looked very good, even though the Fusion weren't running a composition like that. I think the Shock kind of adapt pretty well. So I think the Shock should win this one, but I think this will be a pretty close one. I actually think of the semifinals matches, or of these first two matches, I think this one will be the closest, because I just think the style of play of the Dynasty is pretty good, and the composition they run had seen a lot of success against the Dragons, and I think that the Shock's struggles against the Justice could spell some bad things for the Shock, but ultimately I think the Shock will win this one. Comes to Fusion versus Dragons. This is the match I hope is really good. My ideal finals matchup is Fusion versus Dragons, because I would like either of these teams to win, personally, but I think the Dragons are way better. I think the Dragons have looked a lot better. I think the Fusion will struggle against the Dragons. It could be really close, who knows, but right now I think chances are much higher that the Dragons take this one pretty easily. Their style of play is interesting. Obviously, they don't run the Sigma Hog or any Hog Zarya. They run a lot of Winston. The Fusion like to run a lot of Winston. So these two teams are somewhat similar. It really comes down to what they prioritize and the type of composition they want to run. If you're the Fusion, do you want to try to take Widowmaker or Ashe compositions with Carpe and try to beat Lip? Maybe. The Sombra compositions are probably more likely what they run, because we haven't seen a ton of Ashe or Widowmaker compositions. It's been mostly Sombra and some Tracer, depending on the team, but it's mostly just kind of Sombra-based compositions with some combination of DPS heroes from there. A lot of different ones we've seen, but Sombra's been really kind of central and crucial to a lot of these compositions, so it'll be interesting to see, I think, what these teams do opt into, what type of kind of dive composition they run, or anything of the sort. Like I said, Ashe is only possible because we saw teams like Washington run Ashe a lot, and, Ashe Sombra is certainly a viable composition, but it's a matter of the teams that tend to run them weren't these teams, so I'm not really expecting it. It's possible, but I wouldn't expect it personally. What I think is the most interesting for me personally is seeing some of the compositions that we've seen from some of these teams in the past and how they kind of match up against each other. I think that'll be really interesting to see. Personally, I think that's one of the things I'm most excited to see. But I think that this matchup will be Shanghai favored. I think Shanghai is just kind of better. I feel like these two teams run somewhat similar compositions, and I would say that typically the Dragons just kind of look better running the same types of compositions. So it'll be interesting, but I think the Dragons should take this one pretty easily. I don't think they're going to be challenged too much, though I wish they were. So those are kind of my thoughts on those first couple matches. Ultimately, I am of the opinion that the Dragons are the favorite. I think the Dragons are going to win this whole thing. My opinion hasn't changed at all since the first bracket that I did. I think that it's still very, very possible and very likely that the win goes in the direction of the Dragons. I think they've looked the best so far this season. However, I think that there's a very good chance that San Francisco does take it. San Francisco has been challenged, maybe, in just the sense of they've had a team like the Fusion, and they've had teams like the Fusion and teams like the Eternal who have had really good kind of highs throughout the season. The Dragons, I feel like, were way better than Asia, where I feel like Asia was kind of consistently better. It didn't have like it didn't have the lows that I think North America had. I also don't think that Asia had the highs that North America had for the most part. I think like New York was good, Guangzhou was pretty good, Seoul was pretty good, but like I feel like Paris was better than all of those teams. Obviously, the Fusion was better than all of those teams. Shock was better. And I think when you start getting into teams like the Spark and the Gladiators, like they're kind of around each other. Like I think that the Dragons haven't really been tested against an elite top level team yet. So I'm curious to see how they match up against Philly and how they match up against potentially San Francisco, if they do face San Francisco in some capacity. But I think the Dragons have looked really consistent, and they've looked dominant, like extremely dominant all season against teams who are pretty good. I mean, like, New York was good when they were in North America. They were beating everybody except for the Fusion. And they came to Asia, started to struggle a lot more. I think you can't take away a ton from what New York was able to do based on the fact that they only played a handful of teams, and it was a ton of losses were to Shanghai and the Charge. So I'm intrigued especially by the Dragons and how they match up against the Shock and the Fusion, which is why I'm most excited for the Shock Fusion match, or Dragons Fusion match, because I think that one's interesting to watch. But I think the finals should be Shanghai versus San Francisco. I think that is the most likely result. I think that's the one that we most likely see. I think that the Shock have shown that they are stronger than the Fusion this season. I think they have had more consistent performances against the Fusion. They have more wins against the Fusion than they do losses against the Fusion. The Fusion, I think, are good, and I think that this time off could be very good for them, and it could really help them grind and get better as a whole. But you can say the same about the Shock, and you can say the same about the Dragons and the Dynasty. So I don't think that really benefits anybody more than it does anybody else. And maybe it does. Maybe you can't tell from the outside who's going to benefit more from this time off to kind of grind. I think you definitely have to say that Shanghai and Seoul benefit a lot because nothing changed for them. They didn't have to travel. They didn't have to quarantine for 2 weeks. They don't have to worry about stuff like that, while San Francisco and Philadelphia did, though I'm sure many of the players on those teams, the Korean players, probably were quarantining at home if they had the ability to do so. So it's a very interesting matchup in general, just because you have all these teams that have had different experiences with travel and whatnot. So I'm intrigued by these matches because we have some teams with international players coming over to Korea and a bunch of Korean players as well that are going to be playing in Korea. But I think the big thing to look at with this top four is just kind of consistency, right? It's double elimination once again. So even though Philadelphia and Seoul Dynasty have 2 losses so far, or have a loss so far in the playoffs, they still get another life. They still have 2 lives by making it this far. And the same goes for San Francisco and Shanghai. They have an extra life. They have the ability to lose a game and still win the whole thing. And I think if you're Shanghai or you're San Francisco, especially, you benefit from that. And I think that's true especially for Shanghai, because they have not been tested, I think, in the same way that San Francisco and Philadelphia had been by playing in North America. And I think that Shanghai might slip up against the Fusion, but I would expect them, if they do that, that means they're either playing Seoul or San Francisco. They could maybe lose to San Francisco if that happened, but they should be able to beat Seoul. And I don't really think the Dragons should have much of an issue making it to the finals. It's tough to say that, but I think they're better than both Seoul and the Fusion. We don't know if they're better than the Shock until they play each other, so that's really what I'm looking forward to the most, is seeing how these teams perform against each other. I think it would be really interesting to see a scenario in which, say, the Dragons play the Shock in losers. I think that would be a really interesting thing to see. I don't think it'll happen, but I think it'll be interesting to see if that happened, whether it be first round losers, second round losers, to see kind of, is it going to be the new team, the new best team, or the old guard of the defending champions making their way through. But I'm really excited for these matches because I don't really know what to expect. I don't have precedents of what happened. Like, how good was Shanghai against San Francisco this season? Well, we don't have numbers for that. And how good is Fusion against Shanghai and Fusion against the Dynasty? We don't have those numbers. We don't have that information. So I'm really intrigued. But my grand finals prediction is obviously going to be Shanghai versus the Shock. I think that's really what it's going to be. And I'm going to roll with the Dragons because I think they are the best team. But that is all I have to say today. If you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing for more stuff like this in the future. Comment down below your own picks. But that is all for me. Thank you so much. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.